Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brad Thompson, and I am the Executive Director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome all of you here to our Pope Lecture Series. And I'd like to begin by thanking the John W. Pope Foundation for their support of this lecture series, which we've been running now for 12 years. Before we introduce our speaker, I'd just like to take a minute and make an announcement to all of the students who are in the audience. I know that you will be registering for classes sometime in the next week or two, and I would just like to remind you of a couple of classes that are being taught next semester by the faculty of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. So this is not a full list, but it's a select list. So next semester we have several sections of Introduction to Political Theory being taught. We have a course, American Political Thought, a course called Great Books of the Western World, a course titled Ancient Political Thought, a course in ancient Greek and Roman political thought, a course titled Sovereignty and the State, and finally a course titled Political Leadership. And I would strongly encourage you, if you are interested in great books, if you are interested in philosophy, literature, and politics, to consider these courses, and they are taught by some of the best faculty at the university. I would now like to introduce a Lyceum scholar, Mr. Jack Harrison. Jack hails from Atlanta, Georgia, and he is a junior here at Clemson University and in the Lyceum Scholars Program. And Jack will introduce our speaker, Jack Harrison.
I'll be good in just a moment.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. I'm Jack Harrison, and this afternoon I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Stephen Hicks. Dr. Hicks received his PhD in philosophy from Indiana University after receiving his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Guelph. He is professor of philosophy at Rockford University, senior scholar at the Atlas Society, and executive director of the Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship at Rockford University. Dr. Hicks has held visiting positions at Georgetown University, the Social Philosophy and Policy Center in Bowling Green, Ohio, and the University of Casimir the Great in Poland, and he has been senior fellow at the Objectivist Center. In 2010, he won his university's Excellence in Teaching Award. Dr. Hicks has published 4 books: The Art of Reasoning, Readings for Logical Analysis, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, Nietzsche and the Nazis, and most recently, Entrepreneurial Living. His work has been translated into 16 languages. Dr. Hicks has published widely in academic journals, such as Review of Metaphysics and Business Ethics Quarterly, as well as in other outlets, such as the Wall Street Journal and the Baltimore Sun. Please welcome Dr. Stephen Hicks.
So our subject today is liberal education and how fundamentally important and yet fragile it is. And I want to make a case that education is a deeply philosophical enterprise, and as our philosophical fortunes wax and wane, all of those abstract, head in the clouds, speculative issues that philosophers engage with make a very practical, in some cases, life and death difference to how we live our lives. Philosophers, of course, have a reputation for debating everything, no matter how trivial. And I want to commend to you education as the place where you debate all of those things that start off seeming trivial, but lead to things that are not obviously things you need to think about, and then more important things that you never imagined you would end up questioning and debating. The modern world is relatively fragile, and liberal education is a product of the modern world. You can see some hints of it in classical Greece, in classical Rome, but in very robust form. It started to happen with the rise of the modern world, the breakdown of feudalism and the pre-modern world, and it has had a robust run for the last 3 to 4 centuries. But it is under challenge, and it is under a strong challenge in our generation, and many of us are shocked who were raised in a culture that by and large took liberal education for granted. Yes, we're going to have huge, heated debates and arguments about truth, justice, equality, all of these important issues, but we're going to do so with a commitment to hearing out the best arguments from all contender positions, that our job as professors is first to inform students of all of the competing positions that they need to know about, and to train students how to think critically, to take the heat and to be able to dish it out when necessary, so that they are in a position to live as free individuals. And that's the heart and soul of liberal education. Free your mind. And to free your mind, that is an ongoing, difficult project over the course of many years. And higher education should train people in the highest ability to be able to do so. So what's shocking in our generation is the attack on liberal education, and we see it in many forms. One-sided reading lists, explicitly by professors, not engaging and teaching their students the other side of the view, or presenting cartoon and caricature versions of the other two. Not interested in letting students pursue the truth as they see fit, but being willing to punish students on the grade book for raising the wrong questions, answering the wrong answer, giving the wrong answers in exams, and so forth. Invited speakers being disinvited or subject to threats, sometimes physical threats, when they leave the stage or approach the stage. The student groups or the professors who had the temerity to invite people like that, also subject to attack, attempted silencings, and so forth. And the point is going to be that this is a philosophical change. Now here's Michel Foucault, perhaps the most famous of the postmoderns, announcing that indeed there is a philosophical revolution underway. Just as in the early modern world, all sorts of things were happening in the 1500s and the 1600s in science, in technology, in religion, in politics, in every aspect of human endeavor that amounted over a relatively short period of time, an upending and a rooting out of most of feudal institutions and a replacement of that by what we call the modern world. And what the postmoderns are arguing is that the modern world has run its course, and that in their generation, late 20th century, a similar revolution is occurring. Now, Foucault is here using a geological metaphor, but we are living in earthquake times, that we have all of these surface cultural phenomena that go on, but when we drill down, we get to the deepest questions of human life and human existence, and that's the territory of philosophy, and that the postmoderns are offering a philosophical revolution. They want to replace and or reject and or assault when necessary the foundational institutions of modernism. Now, just in the last generation, the year 2000, this is the University of Wisconsin just up the road from me. This was shocking when it occurred. The rise of a whole battery of speech codes starting to be instituted at institutions that had formerly prided themselves, as liberal education institutions do, with free speech, vigorous inquiry. Any opinion can be articulated as long as we are free to contest it and attack it, and we will do so civilly. Let the better arguments prevail, and that's what education is about. But we started to see in the late 1990s a new generation, right, of professors who had been trained differently, who were wanting to limit the range of opinions that could be articulated. And they were coming from the perspective that students especially, and I've got students highlighted here, and I've got individual highlighted there. We'll say a little bit about the significance of that. But that students are coming not from a free market, liberal democratic, open, tolerant society, but but that students are coming in from a culture that is deeply racist, sexist, exploitative, and so they need to be re-educated at a very fundamental level. We can't let them say whatever they want, otherwise education appropriately will not occur. So students will be disciplined for saying the wrong things. And here's then a list of the things that are the wrong things to say, and we have speech codes and disciplinary codes that are put in place. Now, racist, discriminatory contents, but then we have a fairly long list of items toward the end here. And this is a dramatic shift from a free speech, right, liberal education regime to a more controlled and managed, but it's in a fairly top-down fashion, right, that the professors need to manage students in a certain way. Now, fairly quickly in historical time, the students learned, and the activist students particularly learned, that it wasn't just individual students that were the problem, and they started to learn the speech code weapons and to direct them against their professors. So a sign of progress or regress in this direction has been the uptick in professors who are now being subjected to the same sorts of rhetoric. So here, to people at Yale University, coincidentally tomorrow was Halloween. They were embroiled in a controversy a couple of years ago over what appropriate Halloween costumes, right, students would be allowed to wear. But the point is that there was a number of student groups that wanted to limit the kinds of costuming and the kinds of parties and themes and so forth that could be hosted at the universities. Here we had two professors who were saying, let's not be authoritarian and dictatorial about this. Let's teach people about civility and not to mock people of other cultures. Let's handle this, in other words, the way civil, liberally educated people should do so. But they received immense blowback from the now organized and newly educated students about that tactic, that the speech code had to apply not only to speech but also to dress, and it wasn't just against individual students, it was against the professors. And so what we find, shockingly, of course, from those of us who like to think of ourselves, well, here I am on the stage, right, and you're down there, right, the professors are up here, the students are down there, a role reversal, a power shift, and the students are exercising power. And what's interesting is that these are not conservative or libertarian type professors in their political orientation. These are kind of decent, well-meaning liberals in the somewhat strange American sense of liberal, right, education. They are now on the receiving end. Coming to the Middle West, Laura Kipnis, a professor at Northwestern, another well-regarded university. Another professor at her institution was under various kinds of harassment charges and was being subjected to what she thought was a witch hunt at Northwestern University. One of the pillars of liberalism is due process, and of course that comes out of the same epistemological framework. We need to hear both sides, the evidence, and we will decide guilt or innocence based on reason and the evidence, and we will conduct it in civil fashion. We're not going to let mob rule override the rule of law. So she was voicing concerns, and again was subject to angry student mobs demanding her resignation and various sorts of attacks. And again, not someone who is a conservative or a libertarian in her orientation. Going further west, a biology professor at Evergreen College. Students who had been very vocal and very organized at Evergreen wanted to have a protest day to protest the endemic deep racism that they saw as characterizing American society, and that they demanded that everybody not attend classes, right, for the day, that instead everyone should show up at a protest march. And Professor Weinstein was saying, look, class time is important, my students are here to learn. You guys go ahead and do your protest if you want, but I'm not going to cancel my classes, right, as a matter of principle. Students who want to come to my class, I'll still conduct my class. And for that, he was subjected to what ended up in a kind of witch hunt that ended him resigning from the institution, saying, this is not why I became a professor. And again, his political orientation is not conservative or libertarian. It's not just politics. There's something deeper, right, that's going on in these cases. Now, I want to go back to the beginning rather, of the modern world when witch hunts weren't just metaphors but were real things. And what we consider modern liberal education was born. And it was born out of a fight against authoritarian institutions that felt that it had a lock on the truth. There was one truth and other views should not be exposed, and that certain views should be censored, and that those who had the inappropriate temerity, again, to argue against the received books, to argue in favor of the books that were banned, and to argue theories that were thought to be heretical, those people could and should be subject to torture and execution. And there was a wide wave of these that was going on late 1500s, late 1600s. Early intellectuals, again, intimidated into not arguing for views that they knew would run afoul of the authorities, and so forth. So here I've got what was the cause of the day, and it's a big debate over whether the Earth is at the center of the universe or whether the Earth is a satellite rolling around and rotating on a double axis, the sun. But we have an official pronouncement from the most important institution in Europe at the time saying that proposition is forbidden. And 16 years before announcing this, it had, in response to Galileo at this point, it had in fact tortured and executed Giordano Bruno for, among other things, advocating the Copernican hypothesis that the sun is at the center of the system. So this is something that intellectuals take note of, and of course this is happening primarily in Italy, which then has the best universities in the world. All of the best professors want to teach in Italian universities. The best graduate students want to go and study in Italian universities. This sends a signal, and there was a counter reaction against this. The younger intellectuals who were committed to a broader spirit of inquiry were starting to fight back, and the battle is engaged. So I want to give you, again, the contrast for them. Plato, I don't know if you've read The Republic, right, in the myth of the cave, but they, against not only kind of the authoritative institution, the whole idea of what proper education consists in was being rethought in the 1500s and the 1600s against a classical model or an ancient model or a pre-modern model, whatever label you prefer, that had followed a kind of Platonic model here. The allegory of the cave starts off by arguing, I don't know if you can see, here's us. We're born at the bottom of a cave. We are chained, and somewhat metaphorically, we're trapped in our bodies, but our minds need to be freed from this dark cave. The world around us that we see is really just shadows on the wall. It's illusions. It's not reality. But we've been conditioned to kind of like it in the cave. We're fed, we're looked after, but someone needs to come along and break our chains. And this is where the teacher comes in, someone wise who has been enlightened, and to break our chains and to force us to stand up and to turn around and face towards the light. And the assumption here is that naturally we don't want to do this. We're lazy in addition to our ignorance. And so it has to happen as a matter of compulsion. The teachers have to impose a certain discipline on you. And they are authorized because the truth and higher truth is so important to get people up and out of the cave. So they drag people kicking and screaming, that's an overstatement, but they drag them against their will up out of the cave. The bright light hurts their eyes. This education enlightenment process is very painful to us. But finally, we reach the higher world. We receive the sun, the source of all light, being, and goodness, and we become enlightened. And then, becoming enlightened, we have an obligation ourselves to go back down into the cave and grab the next generation of ignorant young people who are wallowing in filth at the bottom of the cave, and against their will drag them up. So what we have is a model of education. Now I'm doing a slightly cartoon, exaggerated version of Plato. Sometimes it's extreme, more extreme than that. You know, we do know there are lots of very strict traditional schools. We can see them where education seems to fit this model. You follow the rules, and that's the most important thing. You do what you're told, you do it when you're told, and the teacher is the authority. You don't question the authority. And you are naturally undisciplined, perhaps sinful in more religious versions, and unruly, that if you are going to become a good person and even fit for education, discipline must be imposed upon you by outside authorities. You have to learn obedience. The original sin in religious form was a kind of disobedience, but even if not, children in more secular form are viewed as being naturally rebellious and unfit for proper human company. Children should be seen and not heard, and all of that sort of stuff. So they need to learn obedience, but they're also prey to all sorts of false theories, and because of perhaps their inbuilt inappropriate desires and urges, likely to be tempted down the wrong path, so they need to be shielded from anything that is false or immoral, and only exposed to the true, authorized, and good works. And that requires, of course, censorship, and that education is not something that we naturally want to do. It hurts, it's painful, but it's good for us, and so we ought to do it. We have to gird our loins and either ourselves push on or be forced to do what is good for us. Now, this is the model of education that is then instantiated over the course of many centuries, but it starts to be challenged in the early modern world. I just want to run through a couple of the big names here and pull out some quotations about where the challenge is coming from. And here's Montaigne, and it's an international challenge. It starts to be mounted here. Montaigne is a Frenchman, and his theme is that a truly educated person will exercise independence of judgment, right? That you're in control of your mind, and you need to learn how to exercise it for yourself. There might be received truths from Scripture, from the wisdom of the ancients, but the fact that they are received, even if they are true, doesn't do you any good until you understand it and process it for yourself. So his own reasoning: who follows another follows nothing. Don't be a follower. Right? You might have your professors be guides and point you in various directions, but you have to make your own path and make up your own decisions. And a very broad claim, astonishing claim for the time: truth and reason are common to all men. It's not the province of an elite number of philosophers or specially trained theologians, right, or those who have received revelations, or those who have been properly initiated, that only a small elite number of people have access to the truth, and the rest of us should either have faith and follow obediently those people. The truth is accessible to every individual, because every individual has the capacity of reason and has the control over using it. And that freedom to use your mind or not is fundamental, and that's what education should be about. Astonishing for the 1500s. Now, this is 1575. I'm just going to march a couple of generations. Francis Bacon: knowledge is power. Using the Plato's cave as a foil here, what is the purpose of knowledge? And on the Plato's cave model, one idea is to say, well, we're all in the cave, this physical world, but all truth and all reality, higher reality, is in another dimension, and the goal really is to get out of this world and to contemplate and focus on the next and the higher world. A modern revolution is to say, yes, knowledge is important, but it's knowledge in this world. Knowledge should empower people. They get knowledge not because we want to get out of this world, but because we want to make this world a better place. Knowledge is a form of power, and power then should be distributed across all people. We want to empower people, and particularly free people. Galileo argues this is not something that should be seen as irreligious. He's in his great battles with the Catholic Church over whether the heliocentric model can be argued or not, or whether it should be a matter of authoritarian belief, right, or disbelief. And what he is arguing is that if we understand our place in the world appropriately, we will see that God gave all of us, our Creator, senses and reason, and He gave them to us for a reason. He wants us to use them to understand this beautiful natural world that we have created. God created the world, studying it and learning how the world works, the entire scientific project. That should not be an irreligious project. And God does not want us to turn off our minds and just believe things because various authoritative people have told us. So people who are blind faith followers are in fact not practicing religion appropriately. Reason is given to human beings, and we should use it. And so he's arguing for an openness, a liberal attitude toward the sciences, and we will have the arguments about how best to make scriptural interpretations and scientific interpretations compatible with each other. Jumping ahead another generation, and this is international. Now we have an Englishman. After Galileo was silenced, the universities in Italy did decline. Most of the action, intellectual action, did shift to Northern Europe. And so the English Renaissance particularly is taking off, and the Dutch Renaissance. And here is John Milton. I won't read the whole quotation. But again, astonishing for the time, arguing for complete freedom of speech, that you should not have to ask permission from the government and get a license to publish something. Anybody should be able to publish anything on their own dime, right, and with their own permission, so to speak. And any viewpoint should be allowable. And he's arguing, again, that truth and reason are common to all people, and that those are very powerful forces. Yes, there's lots of false ideas and beliefs and dangerous ideas out there, but Milton is making the point, as long as we have the power of reason, truth will be on our side. Truth will prevail as long as we let the battle happen freely and openly. And then John Locke, another generation later, culminating in many of these trends in Locke's overall philosophy. But of course, one of the big battles of the 1600s, carrying on the battles of the 1500s, have been over religion. And Locke is arguing that religion should be something each individual has to think about for himself or herself, that it's absolutely important, and it only works if we do it for ourselves. If we just happen to be born somewhere and we believe things because we're conditioned by our society to believe it, that's not going to do you any good. If you believe certain religious truths because smart people around you believe certain religious truths, they might be right, but that's not going to do you any good. People need to think for themselves. They need to be free to survey the alternatives out there and make their own independent judgment about what proper belief in this area requires. And then socially, and this is the main point of the letter concerning toleration, this means if we're going to take individual judgment on all of these important matters in life very seriously and let anybody try out any ideas, well, we know that people are going to come to believe all sorts of things that are just crazy, weird, offensive from our perspective, and that's going to require that socially we practice tolerance. That I can't force you to believe the right thing and you can't force me to believe the right thing. So again, a kind of liberalism is going to be required. I have one more quotation from Locke, because in addition to his famous epistemological works and his political works and his works on religious toleration, he wrote another essay that's lesser read, his thoughts on education, and it ties directly into our theme. And against this idea that education is something that we don't want to do, that the best education is something that should be forced on us, that education, if it's going to be done properly, is going to be painful and something that we approach as a matter of duty. We find in Locke this very modern, right-sounding phrase where he says explicitly, and I'll read this one because I love it and it's so important. This is the origin of full liberal education in the modern world. Great care is to be taken that education never be made as a business to him. And by business, he means the attitude that a lot of people have when they get up Monday morning and have to go to work. They're dreading it. Education should not be like that. We naturally, right, as I said, even from our cradles, love liberty. We are free people and have therefore an aversion to many things because they are enjoined us. And that's an old-fashioned word for saying, and we've all experienced this, I'm sure, right? You're told to do something, doesn't matter what it is. The fact that you were told that you have to do this, you don't want to do it. Right? That offends your human dignity. I choose for me what I'm going to do. I've always had a fantasy, an idea, that learning might be a play and a recreation to children. Now, the point of all of these is from Montaigne to Bacon to Galileo to Milton to John Locke. That is 1 century in human history. And in that 1 century, a very sophisticated and international, from the European perspective, overturning of centuries and almost 2 millennia of a model of education, right, that we consider the pre-modern, and a replacement of it by what we now think of as modern liberal education. Now, I've got a chart here, right? Don't copy down the chart, take a picture. But on whatever dimensions of education you're interested in, there is an opposition on all of them. What's the most important thing? Should students learn to be obedient, or should we focus on independence? Are we starting with morally blank slates, or are we starting with people who are bad and perhaps sinful, who need to be corrected? Should we use a lot of punishment and painfulness and impose discipline, or do we assume that people are naturally curious and we can make education fun and a delight for them, and they will naturally learn the things and so forth? Should we have censorship, or should we have open debate and discussion? Complete opposition. Now, the point I want to make is that the postmoderns, when Foucault, for example, says the deepest strata have been uncovered again, is to say that both the pre-modern and the modern ways, those philosophical revolutions, and including the educational programs that flow from them, are faulty. They need to be overcome. We need to be postmodern. And what does that mean? Well, another postmodern thinker, Foucault is perhaps the most famous, but Rorty, I think, is also very famous and perhaps deeper than Foucault on a number of things. Postmodern task, where we are in our generation, is to try to figure out what the age of faith, that is to say, a pre-modern or perhaps more religious authoritarian approach to philosophy, and the age of enlightenment, that's the more modern, scientifically, philosophically liberal approach, seem to be beyond recovery. So we have a first-rate American philosopher, usually labeled as a postmodern, arguing that everything that has gone on for the last 2,000 plus years, 2 major experiments have failed, and we are wondering what we need to do next. Foucault is a Frenchman, Rorty is an American, here's John Gray, he's a Brit, arguing the same point, that we are in a position where now we've been trying this Enlightenment thing for a few centuries now, and if we look around, we see that it has been a failure. We live in the dim ruins of this modernist Enlightenment project, and it's time to recognize the failure for what it is and go post whatever that is. Now, I don't want to go through all of this in great detail, but these are the institutional frameworks, right, for the modern world. There's this philosophical revolution I've mentioned here in Reason, Francis Bacon, John Locke. We also should give some credit to René Descartes. And what makes them all modern is that they make reason fundamental to human knowledge. Not mysticism, not revelation, not faith, not just believing things because you're lazy and you want to stick with whatever makes you feel comfortable right now, but rather reason is the way that human beings really come to know. And that reason is a faculty of the individual, so that means we need to respect individuals' freedom to think for themselves and to act on the basis of what they think is best for their lives. And since we think reason is powerful and competent, individuals can take charge of their lives and make a go of it. They don't need authoritarian institutions to order them around and to tell them what to do and so forth. And that has then politically liberal revolution implications for democracy and republicanism. It also extends to the economic sphere. We break down feudalism and we let people make it on their own, decide what they're going to produce, what they're going to trade for, negotiate for their prices, in effect be in charge of their individual economic lives. But the implication that reason is fundamental also means that science becomes important. And we can see physics coming on board in the 1600s, chemistry in the 1700s, biology in the 1800s, psychology, and all of them are saying we can, through empirical and rational logical studies, figure out the way the world works. And it's interesting that all of those modern sciences that we take for granted as part of our cultural institution are very new in historical time, and the foundations for them were not laid until first the philosophical revolution of the 1500s. And then, of course, with science, you start to apply that. We get the Industrial Revolution of the 1700s and its revolutionary transformation of the world that we live in. We apply science to a human being. We get to old wives, but we uproot all of the old wives' tales and the witchcraft and the astrology and just silly traditional recipes for solving people's problems, and we put medicine on a scientific footing. And then what happens over the course then of the modern world is the amount of wealth, the amount of freedom, the amount of health, and the stuff that we have available to us all skyrockets. And really, this is another interesting historical fact that for the first time in human history, late 1700s, you start to see intellectuals saying, we can solve all problems. Now that might be a hubris, but the idea that on every important problem that have plagued human beings forever, we can figure out what the problem is, and using human smarts and ingenuity, find a way to solve that problem and make progress. And the idea then that history is not just, there were the good old days and it's just going to go downhill from now on, or it's just the same damn thing over and over again in a cyclical pattern, but that rather human beings should expect to see their lives improved and their children's lives improved. And that in principle, there's nothing that we cannot do. That is a legacy of the Enlightenment. Now, when the postmoderns then say this Enlightenment vision has led to a dim ruins, or that it's a failure and we need to move past it, this is then what we find attacked. Obviously, individualism, the science, the capitalism, liberalism, and so forth in various ways we should expect, to the extent that we think all of that is a fraud, a dramatic reshaping of what a proper intellectual framework should look like, and especially what a good education or appropriate education should look like. Now, here's Foucault, or a Foucauldian scholar, arguing that this is the thing that needs to be attacked. And so a big part of the postmodern framework is an epistemological shift that has also occurred as the modern world developed. Most postmoderns are very skeptical. They're subjectivistic, relativistic. Those are technically different terms, but that movement has said the Enlightenment claims that reason is competent, that science can figure out all of the truths, that we individually can take rational control of our lives and make a go of it. That is a flawed position. And there's a very strong formulation here. Say, here are the big things that we've come to believe, that there is such a thing as reason, that we can figure out the truth, that we can acquire knowledge of the way the world works, and the scientists and various others are holding up all of their prize achievements. That what Foucault is arguing is that is meaningless. And it's not just that we have rational debates over what the truth is. You have your reason and I have my reason, but that process of engaging in a rational discourse and the expectation that out of that discourse we're going to achieve something called knowledge or the truth, that the best philosophy of his generation, the argument is, has showed that can't happen. And so the claim is going to be that by the time we get to 2 generations ago, the first generation of postmodernism, philosophy has entered a very skeptical phase. Right? It has run its course, and the main schools of philosophy, particularly the continental schools of philosophy, have abandoned the idea of modern reason and the Enlightenment. Now, if that's the case, what are the implications of that? Do we believe that all human beings have reason? Well, if we don't believe that reason is important, then the fact that all people have it, that doesn't become very important at all. Do we think that on important matters, by debate and discussion, we can reach the truth? Well, no, we don't believe in that anymore. When we start to turn to even more difficult issues in ethics about justice and morality and liberty and equality, and we have these heated debates about what they really mean and what the true position should be, if we abandon all of that, so we abandon truth, justice, reason, and so forth, well, what are we left with? And the answer is power. Power is what we're left with. And the fact that some people have more of it than others. So it's not that when we are arguing, we're letting the better arguments and the better facts prevail. It's a matter of trying to assert our power over other people. And what we call argumentation, it's just a rhetorical tool that we're trying to use to bludgeon people in various ways. And of course, they are trying to do the same. Now, as an implication for what this means for education, here's Frank Littricchia, a leading postmodern literature professor just up the road, right at Duke University, arguing, well, this is old news, second generation. Postmodernism, quote, seeks not to find the foundation and the conditions of truth. So we're not in the truth business anymore. Rather, to exercise power for the purpose of social change. Professors have power. And they should use that power to exercise social change. In accordance with what? Well, what direction of social change? Well, you have your agenda, your value agenda. Is my value agenda true and universal? Well, we don't believe that anymore. It's just subjective. I have my power agenda, and I have a position of power, so my job is to use that power on my students. It's not liberal education. One's task as a professor is to help students, quote, spot, confront, and work against the political horrors of one's time. Now, there's a political agenda there, right? Obviously, the claim then is going to be that the modern world and all of the claims of the Enlightenment thinkers and so forth that we're making progress, we're making the world cleaner, beautiful, and more free, and so forth, all of that is a fraud. We are living in the dim ruins. We're living in a horrible society marked by all sorts of pathological social dimensions. My job as a professor is to make students believe that. And of course, what we do know is if they've come to believe that, they're trained to believe that, they will become angry, they will become depressed, they will become all sorts of negative emotions, and when the frustration builds up enough and they have been properly directed toward the targets, they will go out as activists and take on those targets. Andrea Dworkin, postmodern feminist of a certain sort. Right, you know this word? Yes. I won't read it, but you can read it, or I won't say it out loud, but you can read it, right? Invasion, ownership, predation. We pretend that we're interested in liberty, equal rights, progress, but really that's not the agenda. We live in a patriarchal society of power dominance. And in this dimension, it's males who are using all of their social power, including the power they have in the bedroom, to make it clear to women who is in charge. And the important word in this quotation is the word normal. It's not that predators, right? Of course, sexual predators, we call them rapists, right, in extreme form. It's not that they are some wacky, weirdo minority among men. That's the normal male type. And so this idea that men and women can live harmoniously together, respect equal rights and liberties, and that men genuinely care about the women in general, and then of course the women that they care about in particular, that is a fraud. This is the reality once we rip off the mask of modern society. Jacques Derrida, deconstructionist. Deconstructionism is a literary application of postmodernism. We don't need the details right now, but I want to make a political point here. Deconstruction, as he puts it, was inspired by a certain spirit of Marxism. And this is going to take us in a direction of saying that politics, in addition to philosophy, is important to the postmodern story, and a certain kind of politicization then of education is going to be part and parcel of the program. Now, I want to make a little plug for my book called Explaining Postmodernism. What I do in my book is I trace 200 years of modern philosophy. Postmodernism is this really big, sprawling intellectual and cultural movement. There's a number of strands that developed and came together as intellectual movements do, and then they become social movements. On my telling of the story, and I take a lot of heat for this, I name Immanuel Kant as the main bad guy. And lots of fun discussions online. Kant really is a mixed guy in many regards. He's a good guy, I think, some on superficial issues, but genuinely felt. But the claim I want to make is that he is the most important thinker in setting up a counter-Enlightenment, and he takes philosophy in a direction that he essentially does conquer the German intellectual world of the 1800s, and that was the best philosophy in the world, right, being done at the time. And there are then all sorts of post-Kantian schools that emerge, and things become more and more skeptical, and postmodernism comes out of that. Now, Kant does have a reputation for being a political liberal, and in the online and professional reviews and discussions, we have ongoing discussions about the extent to which Kant was a liberal or not a liberal. So I want to just put a couple of quotations here that are directly relevant to our discussion of education today. Kant also wrote significantly and lectured on education, and he does represent, in some respects, a return of a pre-modernism, right? The history of freedom begins with badness, right? For it is man's work. So he's not in favor of liberal education because he thinks liberalism is about freedom. It's about autonomy, but if you're starting with people who are, especially as children, bad and undisciplined, we can't give them freedom. We need a different kind of education. And in education, he goes on to say, above all things, and notice the above all things, obedience is an essential feature. Education begins with obedience, not with independence, not with freedom. And Kant in epistemology, this is his more important works here, but he does mount as significant and very sophisticated and brilliant. The man was a philosophical genius. As much as I disagree with him, he is the most important philosopher of the last 300 years. All philosophers need to know Kant inside out in order to be able to understand the modern world. But what he does want to argue is that philosophy started off in the modern world, Bacon, Descartes, Locke, and the others very optimistically saying that reason, we can solve all of these problems. And then the technical and professional philosophers, they go to work, and all of the major schools of philosophy that had developed in the modern world, by the time we get to Kant's generation, had problems. And what Kant is doing is diagnosing all of those problems and saying, look, we've been trying this reason thing for 200 years, and all of the leading schools are reaching these various dead ends. We need to recast philosophy away from the idea that what we're trying to do when we are doing knowledge, or what we're trying to do when we use our reason, is to come to understand an external objective world, and that we can do so successfully. That project is impossible, and we need to recast philosophy on a subjective foundation. And this is his so-called famous Copernican revolution, where we stop being objectivist in any fundamental sense and become subjectivist in some sense. And then the claim is that over the course then of 200 years, philosophy goes increasingly in a subjective direction. Now, just so on a leaps and bounds here, those of you who have studied some philosophy, particularly the continental tradition, will recognize these names. Kant died in 1804, but you jump 40 years, we have Kierkegaard, right, a huge name in theology, and often cited as a forerunner to existentialism, one of the major philosophical movements of the 20th century, arguing that one must, quote, crucify reason, right, and leap into the absurd, that a genuine life amounts to, in effect, abandoning reason and embracing the opposite. Jumping another 40 years, Friedrich Nietzsche, everybody has heard of Nietzsche, right? God is dead, the Overman, the Superman, and so forth, but on Nietzsche, with respect to knowledge, instead of valorizing and saying how important reason and the human intellect is, how it elevates us and makes all things possible to us, well, how pitiful, how shadowy and fleeting, how aimless and capricious the human intellect is. Dismissive of that as not a very important capacity of human beings. Heidegger, jumping another 40 years, and all of the postmoderns are steeped in their Heidegger, for reasons I'll get to in a moment, talking about some technical issue in metaphysics that he has raised and said, look, metaphysics has reached this contradiction, and usually that's seen as a problem, but for Heidegger that's a celebration, because if we can show that fundamentally people who try to reason their way to truth about the world, they're necessarily going to reach contradiction, and what that means is that it's going to break the sovereignty of reason. We have to break the sovereignty of reason. It's not sovereign, it's not a special. The fate of logic is also decided. Logic disintegrates, right? And so we're going to set aside logic. And so the point then is, this is just a march across now 120 years or so that philosophy becomes increasingly skeptical. And now we get to the postmoderns, Foucault, Derrida, Rorty. I haven't mentioned Lyotard, but he's another huge name. He's the one who is most often given credit for describing the movement as postmodernism, the postmodern turn, and the phrase, the skepticism about meta-narratives, is a Leotardian phrase. But I want to do some biography here, because notice that Heidegger was doing his publishing in the 1920s, and almost all of the postmoderns will cite him as significant. All of these guys are being born in the 1920s and the early 1930s. And so as Heideggerian philosophy, as this increasing skepticism percolates through and comes to dominate the philosophical world, these four very intelligent men are going on to university, graduate school. All of them are getting their PhDs in philosophy and in technical epistemological philosophy. So they are all educated at the highest level, very good universities in the United States and Europe on the state of the art in philosophy by the time we get to the 1950s, when they are then mature. And so there's a philosophical thesis, and my claim here is, if you're interested in understanding current cultural events and you're disturbed by some of them, a lot of them have to do with, why aren't these people willing to engage in looking at the facts and arguments and having civil reason? And the argument with me, the reason is going to be that they are coming out of a just philosophical school that says those things are unimportant. And they have PhD imprimaturs and a wide movement behind them who are saying that's not where the game is. So you need to learn some philosophy, and you need to spend some time in epistemology to get up to speed. So add that to your curriculum, at some point. I'm not saying become a philosopher, but it's got to be part of your intellectual arsenal. There's a problem with my analysis so far. I think it's a partial story, but it's not the complete story. And we do have to say some things about politics, because postmodernism is partly an intellectual movement. And if you are skeptical and relativistic and subjectivistic deeply, and you say, well, what should we be doing in education? What should we be doing in universities, which are all about knowledge, and so forth, but we don't believe in knowledge anymore, we're going to have to do something very different. It's going to be a different agenda. And politics is a part of the agenda. Now, part of the issue here is that, this is when I started to think about these issues. There's a puzzle here, because if you're really skeptical and relativistic and you think everything is just a matter of subjectivity, you would expect people to be believing just all over the map. So we got, I don't know, a couple hundred people here maybe. If we're all subjectivists and relativists, well, what should our politics be? And we just go around the room. We should find people all over the political map. After all, it's just a matter of subjective preference, and we're all different, and so forth. One of the fascinating things about the first two and a half generations of postmodernism, depending on how you count where we are now, all of the postmoderns are not distributed. They're all part of a very narrow part of the political spectrum. And there is a political activism that comes out of a far left end of the political spectrum. Lyotard edited and published and hung out in very far left intellectual circles. Foucault joined the French Communist Party in the early 1950s. He eventually broke with them, but then he went all the way from being a member of the French Communist Party to being a supporter of Mao and communism in China in the 1960s. And then he got tired of that, and in the 1970s he became someone who gave a thumbs up and a ringing endorsement to the Islamic theocratic revolution in Iran, of all places. And the point is, he is about as anti-liberal as you can get consistently in his political outlook. Jacques Derrida did not join the French Communist Party, flirted with the idea, but he published in far-left journals and was intellectually sympathetic all the way through. Richard Rorty is an American. Communist Party has never had a strong foothold in the United States, but on the American spectrum, about as far left as you can get, and we typically call those people far-left social democrats in our context here. That's where Richard Rorty hangs out. So the politics is also important, and the history is also important, because if you go to the time when these young men and the dozens and hundreds of leading intellectuals who become the famous postmodernists in the middle part and latter part of the 20th century, all of them are growing up in a political, intellectual climate in which Marxism is the dominant version of left politics. And so what we have to do is understand what was going on, not only intellectually, philosophically, but also politically. And the point is going to be that by the time we get to the 1950s, the far left is in a kind of disarray. They're very disillusioned. And so you kind of have to imagine yourself as a young person. You're idealistic, you're politically active, and you come to believe in a kind of socialist utopia. And you believe it's going to bring forth the beautiful society, and you read your Karl Marx, and you read all of the neo-Marxists and so forth, and then you're very smart. And you start actually looking at the world. And the way the world looks to you in the 1950s, which is the decade that the first generation postmoderns are all getting their PhDs, it's not good for Marxism. And what we find is, Marx had published Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels in 1848. The revolution was supposed to be coming any time now, and it wasn't materializing. Capitalism was supposed to be exploiting its poor people and driving them to misery and creating this revolutionary class. But if you look at the poor people in the United States, what are they doing? Well, they're buying cars and television sets, and they're taking vacations across the country, and they're getting fatter and fatter, so they're not exploited particularly much. And of course, the economy goes up and down, but they have jobs, and they are seemingly complacent and comfortable. And then, more importantly, when you look at the great models of what communism is supposed to be and the beautiful society it's supposed to be created, if you look at what's actually going on in the Soviet Union, it's pretty bad. It's pretty dark. And if you look at what happened in Hungary when some students and some workers were protesting what was going on under their version of communism, and the Soviets and the government sent in the tanks and the troops and killed people and tortured people, it doesn't seem that the facts are supporting the claim that socialism is going to bring prosperity and humanity to human beings. There was a crisis of faith. And what am I going to do when my beautiful vision of a society doesn't seem to be working out? Well, if you believe in reason, if you believe in evidence, and you believe in logic, then you change your mind. But what happens if at the same time you've come to believe that reason, logic, and evidence don't matter? It's not about any of those things. And you have these strongly felt, passionate commitments to a certain version of politics. Well, you double down and you come up with a new strategy, and that's why the left changes its tune dramatically in the 1960s and the 1970s. There's a widely announced, and this is an international movement, the old left is dead, we have a new left. And the new left has very different strategies, very different aims, but a same adversarial stance toward liberalism and capitalism and all of the pretend claims of what they call Enlightenment and so on. And part of this is smart young people saying, I'm going to become a professor, I'm going to become a teacher, and then in my position of power, I can advance the cause from that new institutional perch that I'm going to acquire. Everything, this is Frederick Jameson, also up the road from you at Duke University. Everything is, in the last analysis, political. Political commitments are fundamental. And any tactic, fair or foul, even the distinction between fair and foul doesn't mean anything anymore. That's all subjective. Do what it takes to advance your agenda. Now, what does this mean for education? Well, it becomes pretty straightforward top-down application once you have the abstract philosophical principles in place. So I'll make a few of the connections now. Richard Rorty, the Enlightenment had said all human beings have the power of reason, and we need to train free human beings to use the reason and tolerate a wide range of opinions in our class. Let the students read the great minds and put them in collision with each other. And ultimately, all people will come to see the truth. The best arguments will prevail, and everybody can learn. Well, if we don't believe that anymore, there is no such thing as universal reason. Instead, what we find is we're in what Rorty calls our ethnocentric predicament. We're all just born into various groups, and those different groups have different histories, and what we call our reason really is just conditioned by the groups that we find ourselves to have been born in. There's no way to transcend our groups and really understand another person's framework or another culture's framework. What we think is reasonable, in quotation marks, and what they think is reasonable, again in quotation marks, different, no way to bridge that gap. We are stuck in our ethnocentric privilege, and that means in practice, we're just going to privilege our group. But of course, you're going to privilege your groups, and there's no way for us to sort out our differences by reason or by appeal to the facts. The battleground is going to be different. Now here's Henry Giraud, one of the leading postmodern philosophers of education, making the application. Within the discourse of modernity, okay, highfalutin language, the modern world, the other, that is to say, anybody who's not like you, right, different racial group, different ethnic group, different gender, different sexual orientation, is often defined within the totalizing and universalistic theories, right? That is to say, in the modern world, we believe that there are universal truths, but we define everyone that create a transcendental, rational, white, male, Eurocentric subject. That is to say, because of the power relations, it's been those guys at the top of the power heap, and they want to make everybody be just like them. And they're using their power to make everybody conform to being rational, white, male, European people. And that's not true to what those other people are. So we have to abandon the Eurocentric model, the rational model, and so forth. Lentrichia had argued, right, postmodernism seeks to exercise power for the purpose of social change. Another leading philosopher of education, Chandra Mohanty, saying, well, yes, exactly right. What we should then do is understand the classroom as a place of power struggles. And in the classroom, we have people who are representative of different groups with different theories, different agendas, different conditioning, and they are in power struggles against each other. Classrooms are, quote, political and cultural sites that represent accommodations and contestations over knowledge by differently empowered social constituencies. In that group, or your classroom, some people have more power just because, say, they're white, or because they are male, or because they were born speaking English, and so forth. And they have more power than the other groups, and of course they try to dominate and impose their agendas on other people. But then teachers and students should see themselves as not in a place where we're engaged in cooperative learning, and that, yes, we might have our disagreements, but ultimately we care about the truth, we care about justice, we care about getting the answers right. That's not what's going on. Instead, it is a battleground where we recreate, resist, and transform ideas about race, gender, and difference in the classroom. Classroom is a different kind of place from the liberal model. Giraud again. Now we have to think, though, it's not just about the students, but what about the teachers? Because if you think of all of the teachers in the United States, they've been raised in the United States, and the United States has a mythology. It believes that it is the nation of the Enlightenment, Declaration rights of human beings that we're gradually extending to everybody, and that we really care, right, and so on. They've all bought into the Kool-Aid. Right? And so what we then need to do in philosophy of education is retrain the teachers. This suggests that to the degree that teachers make the construction of their own voices, histories, and ideologies problematic. What we need to understand, those of us who are going to become teachers, is that our voice, right? So from Giraud's perspective, I would be the white male Eurocentric guy. My voice, right, is problematic. I should feel in some sense guilty and ashamed and realize that my voice is just one voice of many compared to the others that are out there. So if we can get people, particularly teachers, to criticize and understand the problematic nature of their own voices and histories, then they will become more attentive to others, right? People in other groups. And that becomes a deeply political and pedagogical issue. University of Minnesota is just one of many examples at the College of Education. This is from 2 years ago now. Then has taken the postmodern and then Girovian theory and applied it to teacher training. So all of the hundreds of students who go through the University of Minnesota education, teacher candidates must demonstrate that they reject, right, to quote, the American dream and the myth, right, of meritocracy. And then further, aspiring teachers must be able to explain how institutional racism works in the schools, the white, Christian, et cetera, dominant model that has too much power in this society. Andrea Dworkin, kind of a feminist version. There's lots of subversions of postmodernism here about male-female relations. Unless you think sciences and engineering are immune from postmodernism, at least in the sciences and engineering, we have facts and truth and reason and math and so forth. Well, we must, quote, escape from the patriarchal science in which the conquest of nature is projection of sexual dominance. What is science? Right? It's all these guys, and they say that they're logical and rational, but what do they want to do? They want to penetrate nature's secrets, right? And so forth. And then we want to build bigger and longer missiles that can blow things up to assert our power on the foreign stage. So science is deeply complicit, and it needs to be recast in a postmodern feminist direction in this particular variation. So the point is, again, another chart. We don't want to read through it, but all of the things that are important to modern philosophy and the themes then that dominate the liberal approach to education are contested and replaced by a different set of assumptions, and education then must get recast. All right, now, part of what I've been doing so far is just trying to understand postmodernism. There's a lot of stories that can be told here, but I want to push back a little bit and say some things on behalf of modernism and the Enlightenment, and most particularly liberal education. Right? Now, there are a lot of philosophical issues that are deep here, psychological issues. There's a lot of history that needs to be sorted out, and I've just been waving my hands at a big amount of that. But we do have data, and I want to argue that despite the cynicism and the pessimism about the Enlightenment project, it has demonstrably accomplished a lot, and it's accomplished a lot precisely along the dimensions that the postmoderns claim to care about. So solving the problem of poverty, eliminating racism, solving lingering sexism or whatever degree of sexism you think is out there. The data is good for the Enlightenment. Now, here's a chart. 1812, every circle on this chart is a country in the world. Along the bottom here, we have income measures. 400,000 is a log scale, 2004, 10, and so forth. Vertical axis is life expectancy at birth from 20 to 35 years. And the point is, 200 years ago, early in the Enlightenment era, the United States is, what, one generation old. All of the countries in the world, that's actually the United States right there, that yellow one. This is England, the richest and most long-lived country in the world. Average income in England is less than $3,000 per person per year. Life expectancy is 41 years. And that's the best. And it's not accidental that these nations are all Western European nations and the United States. Those are the nations where the Enlightenment and modernism first and most significantly transformed human life. Now, I want to just jump 1 century. This happens over the course of 1 century. This is 1912. A large number of countries have broken out. People are living longer, and they are a lot richer. One more 100 years. Most of you are in middle school, I assume, at this point, 2012. This is the distribution. Now, you put all three of those together, this is what you get. 200 years is a blink of an eye in overall human history. 200 years ago, whoops, I don't want to do that. I want to say every single country in the world was down here. We have taken the entire world out of poverty The entire world doubled life expectancy, and at the same time, a lot more people have a chance at living and putting a life together. If you care about poverty and solving the problem of poverty, and you think living longer and living richer is a good thing, the only time in human history that this has happened has been in the last 250 years, and it's precisely because of the philosophical and institutional revolution of modernism. That's data. If you care about sexism, lots of data. And of course, everybody cares about sexism. This is just one set of data over the course of the 20th century about higher education degrees that are granted to women by discipline: bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, medical degrees, doctoral degrees, and so forth. Dramatic upturn. Right? That's progress. If you care about racism, slavery, serfdom, the oppression of people who are different from you, right, politically, again, data. It's striking to think, beginnings of the modern world, 1700s, over 80% of the world's population was either a peasant, serf, or slave. And our great moral crusade against that moral abomination has been extremely successful. And it's only backwaters and underground places in the world where you can still find slavery. That's progress. Racial tolerance and living among different people. This is some data from a few years ago. The blue countries are all the countries where I'm asking questions about racial and ethnic tolerance. Do you have a problem with having neighbors whose skin is a different color than yours? And in the blue places, fewer than 5% of people have a problem with that. And in places where they're differently colored, more and more people will have a problem with that. 200 years ago, most people would have a problem with that. Tolerance and not even seeing racial issues as a serious issue that filters my thinking. We're making progress on that as well. But we do have a very well-educated, culturally positioned group of individuals who are deeply cynical, deeply pessimistic, deeply skeptical, and committed to a value agenda that's quite different from the Enlightenment one. That's the battle that we're engaged in right now. On my view, right, the logic and the facts, right, are against the postmoderns. But of course, this is where philosophy is important, because the postmoderns want to say, do logic and the facts matter? And that's where philosophers have to do good work defending the power of reason, the power of logic, the power of human understanding. And if you abandon that, then you're into today's campus wars. All right, now that's just a very quick overview. My book, Commercial Advertisement, I will tell you the whole story in excruciating detail. And then if you're interested only in the education issues, just published today, I have an article on liberal education versus postmodernism in this academic journal. So in the remaining time, still got the reflexes. I'll take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hicks, for that wonderful talk. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. It is the tradition of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism to take its first few questions from students. So if you are an undergraduate, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for coming today. My name is Will Galloway. I'm a sophomore Lyceum scholar. My question for you is, what do you find to be the most compelling arguments to defend truth and logic and reason against the postmodernists?
Yeah. I think you have to have a twofold strategy. Right? One is kind of a Baconian strategy. You say, if you take truth, logic, reason seriously, and you apply them, you get science, you get technology, you get peaceful nations, and you have to show a lot of empirical results from taking that abstract set of principles and applying them individually and institutionally. So that's where a lot of social science and history becomes very important, and that we get it right. The other strategy is the philosophical strategy, that there are lots of technical issues about truth, knowledge, reason, and so forth, that have to be addressed, and that requires first-rate philosophy, and I think it also requires that you work with the neuroscientists and the psychologists and the cognitive scientists to get it right. So that's what has to happen.
Thank you.
Go ahead on this side.
Hi, my name is Charles Beresford. I'm a freshman here, political science major, and I agree with you on the free speech aspect of education and freedom of thought, but my question is, and I thought about this halfway through your talking about education, was how exactly do you discipline a child for saying something really nasty? So like, if I found out my child called someone the N-word, like derogatory, called a female a not so nice name, was acting inappropriate towards people different religious backgrounds, how would you expect the school and parenting to take care of that?
Right, yeah, it's a very good question, right? So if discipline is not necessarily going to be imposed in an authoritarian direction, but children are immature and uninformed, where is it going to come from if they aren't necessarily going to learn it themselves? One of my favorite education theorists is Maria Montessori, and she was dealing with slum children in Italy, and children who were diagnosed with various sorts of mental disabilities and so forth. And one of the things she noticed was kids, especially when the weather got cold, is they would come to school with runny noses. And what they would then do is just what every kid in the universe does, right? Just wipe it on their sleeves. Right? And she, of course, wanted to teach them a proper habit here. And what she found was what worked universally was when that happened, she would take a tissue out of her pocket and put it to her nose and give a little blow. And they liked her as a teacher. They knew that they were trying to teach her things. And so the point is, she was modeling proper behavior for them. And what was interesting to her when she debriefed was that most of these kids, what happened to them when they were at home, they would wipe their noses on the sleeve. What would the mom or the dad do? Clobber them right upside the head. So by authoritarian physical compulsion, right, you teach them not to wipe their noses on their sleeves. So you do have the two models. You can model appropriate behavior and or impose, right, an authoritarian agenda. Both can work, right? But I think this one is going to work a lot better. So in the case of racism, right, the use of the N-word or all sorts, right, of other ones, I think the important thing is for parents and teachers themselves to model good behavior, right, on this point. Be careful in the language that they use to set a standard. Most children look up to their parents. They look up to their teachers. And if you are doing that, that's going to be a huge amount of the battle. Now, of course, kids are going to say all sorts of things, and we say all sorts of things when we're frustrated. And so then it's just a matter of how do you, when they say something wrong, you know, admonish them, point out that it's wrong, why it's wrong at a level that they're able to understand, but then again provide the positive alternative. And of course, you know, if I'm using an inappropriate word with this person over here, chances are good it's one of my classmates or one of my friends, and I want to be a classmate and a friend with this person, so I can then, as the teacher or the parent, point out, you know, that person's not going to like you, right, and not want to be your friend. So again, you're emphasizing the positive and giving them the better alternative. So I think that's going to work. Over here, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Jacob Fairchild, and I am a senior business major, and you have to forgive me if this is from a misunderstanding of modernism and postmodernism, but could postmodernism be considered a direct result of the modern Enlightenment education, where students are taught to think critically and ask why, but then would they not naturally turn that on the institutions of logic and reason that they're taught and be critical of those institutions?
Right.
And asking why about those reasons, leading postmodernist thought to be a direct result of the modern education.
Right. So there are a number of subspecies of postmodernism. Right. So one way to get to postmodernism is just already to be antagonistic to the major claims of modernism and want to have a different kind of agenda. And that then is to say postmodernism has different roots from modernism. The one that you're suggesting is that modernism starts off with a positive agenda along a number of dimensions, the ones that you mentioned and others. But then if you take modernism's tools, let's use reason and logic and subject the modern claims, including the claims about reason and logic, to themselves, one of the possibilities is that we reach skeptical conclusions, or we find that we can't justify those claims, in which case the rational thing to do would be to believe that reason doesn't work, or the logical conclusion would be that logic doesn't work, and that is a possibility. And I think what typically happens, and there are philosophers who will go down that road, but they don't necessarily become postmoderns. Instead, they just become kind of garden variety skeptics. And typically, if you think reason and logic don't work, then you don't, and you think there's no alternative to that, then you just kind of shut up. Right? And there are a lot of people, not a lot, but a significant number of people who will start off wanting to do philosophy, using philosophy's tool, but think that they lead to skeptical ends. And they end up doing what, in effect, David Hume argued. They say, well, basically, we should just stop doing philosophy and just go off and do various other things. So, yes, that's a possibility.
Thank you.
Over here.
Hey, my question is, you talked about Kant being basically the big bad guy. I want to ask, in today's 2019, what's the general opinion of Kant, specifically in philosophy departments?
Yes, okay, good. All of the major philosophers, and this is more true generally, almost all of them will have 2 or 3 competing schools of interpretation. So there are, in the case of Kant, right, some who will say that Kant was the all-destroyer, right, the way his contemporary Moses Mendelssohn did. That if you take Kantian philosophy seriously, everything is destroyed. That's the interpretation, right, that I'm adopting. It's also the one that Schopenhauer in the next generation and Hegel and Nietzsche and so forth adopted. So that is a mainstream interpretation. But there is another view that says, look, Kant is not the all-destroyer, or at least not in intent. What he's just doing is saying there are limitations to reason, and we need to be more open to some more traditional notions of faith and duty and so forth. And he's trying to carve out a reasonable middle ground and so on. And that you're just being overwrought in saying that he leads in these various negative directions. So there is that school of interpretation, and there are plenty of first-rate Kant scholars who disagree with the interpretation of Kant that I gave you as well. So I would then just urge you to do what I, as a liberal education professor, think everybody should do. Read both interpretations, but more importantly, read Kant for yourself, right, and make up your own mind.
Hi, Dr. Hicks. I'm Joseph Lord. I'm a junior philosophy student here. So I have kind of an in-depth question, and I'm going to start with 2
Well, you're a junior
quotes.
philosophy major. You should have an in-depth. Yes.
Well, so in The Fountainhead, Ayn Rand says that if you were locked in a cage with a man who had abandoned the use of reason and was hell-bent on destroying you, your only recourse would be to use force.
Yes.
In the Crito asks Socrates, why should we care what the masses think? And Socrates basically says, because they can kill us. In the modern world, seeing the results of generally liberalization of education, we've seen the rise in the notion that a man and a woman are exactly the same, that a man can be a woman or vice versa, that homosexuality and heterosexuality are the same things. So we have seen a rise in clearly irrational beliefs. I wonder, and I would wonder for your opinion on this, is there some point that we are the sane man locked in the cage with the insane man who has abandoned reason? Is there a point at which force and censorship can actually do more to defend reason than reason itself can?
Okay. All right, good job, philosophy department. Right, you notice how complex that question was? So he's read Rand and The Fountainhead and pulled out an important theme there, and then we go back to Plato and Crito and Socrates and engaged in the debate over whether Socrates should escape or not, and then we come to the 20th century gender wars and male-female differences. Now, what am I supposed to say in 1 minute in wrapping that up? So, yeah, abstracting the general point is, it's one thing to say how intellectual and social interactions will go if both people are committed at a fundamental level to reason and civility. And then you're going to get a certain social dynamic, and certain things are possible under those circumstances. But what happens when one party is committed to reason and civility, but the other is deeply opposed to reason and civility, and in effect is a madman, right, and or willing to use brutalistic methods, right, in social interaction? And then I think the short answer has to be, well, you can't reason with irrational people. And I think part of good education should be to train your mind to be able to recognize, it's a kind of a high-level BS detector, right? When people are committed to reason or whether they are using reason in a rationalistic way, but there's another agenda going on, or that the person really is someone you need to just defend yourself against. So I do think, intellectual self-defense as well as physical self-defense, right, is appropriate. And we do need to be both intellectually armed and physically armed. If we do find, and this is one of the worrying things, that on campuses that there's an increase in uptick of people engaging in threats and physical intimidation and outright physical violence, then we should be willing, when certain lines are crossed, ourselves to engage in self-defense by using force in response. So I don't believe in a kind of a namby-pamby tolerancy matter that anything goes because I'm committed to reason and that you're a rational person. Yeah, you have to walk the walk if you're a rational person, and if you become a savage beast, then we'll treat you the way savage beasts should be treated.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. I'm sure I can speak for most of us here. We found it very refreshing and enlightening.
Good. Thank you.
So I'm Rachel, a sophomore political science major. My question for you was Lintricia from Duke,
Yes.
the professor. So he says that professors morally ought to, like their job should be to influence students from their position of power for social change, which sounds nice and it feels good, it rolls off the tongue pleasantly, but upon what standards? I know that you can't exactly speak for him, but
Yes.
from your research and your diving into this topic of discussion, upon what standards would he encourage us to make social change? And if he believes in this universal subjectivism, I guess it's a two-part question, if he believes in this universal subjectivism, then what is the point of having a professor?
Yes. Okay, that's a good set of questions. So if we put the question more generally, right? If you believe that there is no truth and all there is power, right? That there is no justice, instead all there is struggle between contesting power, then where do we get our standard for? And the answer to that generally is you can only have a subjective standard. It has to be whatever you happen to believe. That's going to be your value commitment. And epistemologically, there is a whole series of philosophers from Kierkegaard on through Nietzsche to the existentialists who want to say value commitments are not something that we can argue about. They're not empirical, they're not rational, they're not philosophical, they don't come from God. Instead, value commitments are a matter of just making a subjective leap and a subjective commitment into something, and then holding fast to that commitment. So in his particular case, he would then say, I have made a commitment to a certain kind of left politics, so that's what I'm going to use my agenda for. I might, though, be similarly skeptical and say, well, I've just made a commitment to a certain religious stance, or I have made a commitment to some other kind of lifestyle. And the important point is making the commitment and not expecting that other people are going to respect or honor your commitment, but then just doing what you need to do to follow through on your commitments. So if you feel in your bones that a certain kind of politics is absolutely important, and you recognize that professors have a lot of power, then that can be a very attractive career option for you. If you're interested in indoctrination and training the next generation of social activists. But of course, that's not the liberal model at all. Yeah, but that's a good question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Luca Fermento. I'm an economics major here at Clemson. And my question is, did the Enlightenment epistemology fail in any way?
Yes.
And so you don't think that postmodernist philosophers are completely an isolated, self-confirming tribe of people that are wrong?
Right.
So yes, can you explain ways in which it did fail? And further, if we are in this new historical intellectual age of postmodernism, or whatever it will be because it's kind of new,
Yeah.
Is the solution to revert back to a modern liberalism, or can there be a different solution, a different next step?
Right. Well, that's a very sophisticated question, right, and extraordinarily ambitious for the short period of time. So if we think, for example, of science, just to take one aspect of this. Science is an extraordinarily sophisticated set of tools that we have developed, cognitive tools. But all of the elements, if you take a course, say, in philosophy of science, or you take a rigorous course in the sciences about what the method are, think of all of the things that you need to learn and that you have to have confidence in for science as a project to work. You have to think that observation is a legitimate mode of contact between our senses and the world. That we have the ability to form categorization schemes, to take the data that comes in and organizes it in a way. That we can have logical methods to generate hypotheses, and from those hypotheses to generate predictions. So we have to have logical tools. And then we have to have confidence that reality is cause and effect in a certain way so that we can set up experiments and control the various variables, and that we can isolate the variables appropriately, run the experiments, and then run statistical methods and logical methods again, and in some cases sophisticated mathematical methods, and then write it up in a way that's rhetorically persuasive, right, to other people. So, right, observation, categorization, logic, statistics, rhetoric, and so forth, and experimental design, all of those things have to be worked out very well. And those are hard. Right? You know, human cognition is extremely complicated. And you know, we are, I think, in the early days of it. So in one way, I don't fault the first generation of modern philosophers for not getting all of it right. Because it's very easy to, you know, come up with a broad theory of human cognition that's got 40 moving parts in it. And if you don't get all of them right, then your theory is going to reach a dead end. And then this other theory is going to reach a dead end. And it's understandable that some people will say, well, I've run through a few iterations philosophically, and they've all reached dead ends, so I'm just going to give up. Then you become a skeptic. And then, as you suggest, not all of the skeptics are going to be postmodern. And that's why I do think postmodernism is partly a skepticism, but it has to be combined with various other things. Now, I mentioned the political agenda that was endemic in the first two generations of postmodernism. That, I think, is a part of it. So it's not just a bunch of epistemologists, it's a whole movement, and they have some epistemology and they have some politics. The previous gentleman's question on this side here, another important strand coming out of postmodernism is our understanding of human nature and human identity. That's not an issue of cognition primarily, it's not an issue of politics, but it is an issue of biology and human anthropology, and that has to be gotten right. And there's another whole story that needs to be worked out, and the postmoderns have a take on that. So, you know, in one way, it's a truism. It's all really complicated, but we have made progress on some things. I think that is demonstrable, and what we need to do is just see it as a self-correcting process, not give up. Go back, look at the theories, find what the hidden assumptions are, interrogate those, consider what the alternatives are, and work hard.
Thank you.
Okay. Are we done? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight for this wonderful lecture. In particular, I'd like to thank our out-of-town guests for coming, and finally to the students for their great questions. And let's give a rousing Clemson thank you for a wonderful talk to Dr. Hicks.